the next. So hopefully this is a little bit I'm going to run through. I'll just mention though that I'm not going to do trees and planning in Birmingham or City of Nature, what's on there, but we are going to look through what biodiversity ecology and other terms are, why biodiversity ecology is important, a bit about the green infrastructure in Birmingham, legislation, planning policy, Environment Act and new duties, and then come on to the local nature recovery network. This is taken from a presentation we gave to the planning committee, so that's why we've got the other bits on there, to give them some other information around trees and planning. So we start off with some definitions. So you probably have heard these terms before. Hopefully you'll have an understanding of what they are, but just to go over them again. So biodiversity is the variety of life on Earth. It's the variety of ecosystems, habitats and species. So the ecosystems is the interrelationship between habitats and species. The habitats are all the plants and landscape that makes up an area, and the species are obviously the animals and the individual plant species that are within those. Ecology is obviously the interaction between the ecosystems, habitats and species, including ourselves. When we're talking about green infrastructure, we usually are including blue infrastructure in there, so canals, lakes, rivers, streams, all those kinds of things. But the green infrastructure is the network of multifunctional green and blue spaces which are capable of delivering a wide range of environmental and quality of life benefits for communities. Urban forest, when we talk about that, that's all of the trees and other vegetation in the city boundary, regardless of who owns them. You'll have heard us talk about those before. And natural capital is the other thing that we often talk about. So that's the sum of our ecosystems, species, freshwater, land, soils, minerals, our air and our seas are the elements of nature that directly or indirectly bring value to people. So basically, you know, if you're trying to put when we talk about natural capital, you often talk about putting equating something to a financial value. So if we were to talk about what's the natural capital value of bees, for example, what would it cost us as a race, as human beings, to replace the pollination effect of bees? You'd have to have thousands of people, millions of people going around with paintbrushes and pollinating all sorts of plants. So that's how we try and equate sort of a value of what those services are. So valuing the natural environment in local decision making. So we've just said about natural environment. It's the foundation for all aspects of our daily lives. Nature's systems link and underpin human life and the economic activity by cycling water, pollinating crops and regulating climate. What I'll do is I'll PDF some of these slides so we can circulate them around, because I won't read all the words that's on here because it'll get a bit too long. But it's estimated that things like the health and economic benefits from the 4,700 hectares of Birmingham's parks alone is valued at £619 million per year. So for every £1 invested in that green space, it returns about £24 per capita to society. So that's in things like health benefits and I suppose climate regulation benefits, all those kinds of things. So it's there's nothing else really, I think, where you'd be able to invest such a small sum and get such a big return on it. Not even hedge fund banking, I don't think, gives you that sort of return, does it? So the biodiversity and green infrastructure in Birmingham. So we may have seen a map similar to this before, but Birmingham is a total area of 26,800 hectares. We've got a population of 1.1 million people and growing. There's a need for around 89,000 additional homes by 2031. And currently we've got space identified for 51,000 homes. So you can see that there's a difference there between the amount of space we've got identified and the amount of homes needed to accommodate the growing population. So we're all aware of the pressure that puts on existing land within the city's boundary. So whether that be open space or existing estates, so like or areas of development such as like Digbeth, where there's a big shift to move from small scale industrial business use to a mixed residential business type of environment. There's 6,200 hectares of green infrastructure in the city, 3,500 hectares of public open space, 2,383 hectares of designated nature conservation sites. So that's what we can see in the map there. So the orange is our sites of special scientific interest. That's Sutton Park at the top there. So that's also National Nature Reserve. but then we've got areas that are sites of importance for nature conservation, sites of local importance for nature conservation, and then we've got some non-designated areas which are sites which we believe are important for nature conservation, but we don't have the sort of the survey data to actually designate them as one of those sites either of importance or local importance for nature conservation. And you can see they're well distributed across the city, and many of them form linear routes as well. So we've got a linear route that's coming through here. Some of these are rail lines, some of them are following canal lines, some of them are following the river corridor. So the one that comes up through here is the River Ray, the one that comes up round through here is the River Cole, and then we've got some coming across the top here, which is the River Tame as well. So got these routes that all link together, all joined together. So we've got movement, a possibility for movement of wildlife through all of these. This one over here, this is Harborne Walkway linking through to Summerfield Park and Edgbaston Reservoir. And there's 250 miles of urban brooks and streams across there, and we just mentioned those 3 rivers as well. I'm sure most of you live in the city. You'll probably be aware that it's home to a diverse range of wildlife, including legally protected and priority species. So we have otters in the city. Badgers are all over the place. I have to say they are, widespread. Great crested newts, we don't have a huge amount of those, but we do have some. Peregrine falcons, though, again, were a slightly more recent arrival. They've been around for a decade or more now. But we have several pairs nesting in the city. They do like some of the taller buildings, and I was just out at a site on Thursday, looking at a peregrine falcon that's nesting on somebody's balcony, and the flat is occupied, and he's very happy that he's got a peregrine falcon nesting on his balcony outside of his window, because it keeps the pigeons off. So, but it's nice. So there we go. So they take advantage all over the city of those tall buildings, but some of these are we say they're protected species and priority species because they're in decline. So if you're interested in birds at all, you'll have heard about declining numbers of house sparrows, the numbers of swifts that have declined over the years. Hedgehogs particularly declined, and in some areas of the countryside are almost non-existent now. So urban areas can be a stronghold for some of these species that have otherwise sort of declined or disappeared totally from our wider countryside. Part of my role was as a planning ecologist. So this is sort of the outline of what my role would encompass in there. So looking at planning applications, so looking back, including Biodiversity Net Gain, compliance with legislation, local policy, liaising with applicants, looking at developing new planning strategies. So we're talking about development of our biodiversity policies and supplementary planning documents. We also deal with statutory and local sites, so local wildlife sites, nature reserves, national nature reserves, and so on. Of course, we assist with enforcement and planning control, and also the police, the wildlife and crimes officers. So it's a bit of a wide-ranging role in there. There's a lot of statutory legislation and planning policy in relation to biodiversity as well. I think people don't necessarily realise how much there is, but it also doesn't give us often the powers that people think it does, which is always frustrating. We have national planning policy, so we have things like the planning policy framework, the government circular on biodiversity and geological conservation. We have Wildlife and Countryside Act, NERC Act, the Crow Act, so there's Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, Countryside and Rights of Way Act, and of course more recently the Environment Act, which is where things like Biodiversity Net Gain are being brought into force from. Local planning policy and process, so we have the Birmingham Plan and the Development Plan, which sets out our local planning policies, and so they take cues from statutory legislation, but also are sort of the city's drive forwards in how we want to see development occurring in the city. We've got things like our Future City Plan coming forward, which is going to set out a new vision for development in the city, which is looking to have far greater integration of green infrastructure, consideration of climate resilience, and balance that off to make sure we've got these climate resilient, livable cities for the future, bearing in mind that we're going to have an increase in population density going forward. We've also got a whole series of things that we call validation checklists as well. So these are things that people who are making planning applications have to look at to consider whether their development needs ecological surveys or reports being done. I don't expect you to read all the words on these. Then we've got other local documents as well. So we've got guidance on whether you need a ecological geological assessment, looking at indications of when and where you're likely to have to undertake surveys, and what sort of enhancements might be able to be delivered as part of a development scheme. Again, I don't expect you can't read these. These are just to give a flavour of the types of things that we're looking at. But a lot of this is available on the council's web pages. And then we've got biodiversity policy and good practice guidance. So these come through from people like Chartered Institute for Ecologists and Environmental Management. We've got British standard documents for process for designating and designing and implementing biodiversity net gain, biodiversity code of practice for planning and development. You'll probably have heard us talking through, when we've been talking more about trees, about things like BS 3998, which is the tree work recommendations, or BS 5837, which is trees in relation to design, demolition and construction. There are a whole series of all of these British standards, and there is one for biodiversity code of practice as well. So got that. And then we've got, well, what was the biodiversity metric 3.1, which is now 4.0. So over the past few sort of months and years, the government have been developing this biodiversity metric, which is the thing that will be used to monitor the impact of development on biodiversity and be used to secure net gain. So this is where biodiversity net gain comes in. This is the thing that's being mandated through the Environment Act. So just a quick cover of some of these. Again, we'll circulate you so you can read things at your leisure. So pre-2021, the requirement was to avoid impacts, mitigate for those. So try and take measures where you minimize the impact, and then where there was an impact, compensate for that. So replace habitat. The intention was that there'd be no detrimental impact on protected species and habitats, and deliver at least no net loss of biodiversity. The current requirement at the moment is, again, avoid, mitigate, compensate. This is a hierarchy of process. Again, no detrimental impact on protected species and habitats. And at the moment, there is the opportunity, because it's set out in the National Planning Policy Framework, and it is mentioned in the Environment Act, although it's not mandated yet, so it isn't compulsory. But to deliver biodiversity net gain, this is voluntary, as best practice as per the National Planning Policy Framework guidance. However, come November this year, it'll still be the same: avoid, mitigate, compensate, no detrimental impact on protected species and habitats, but there must be delivery of biodiversity net gain. That'll be a statutory requirement. So so developments that meet the requirement for having to do this must deliver net gain. So the background to that is there's been a whole series of reports over the years. I mean, pretty much saying the same thing, but eventually, slowly but surely, legislation and policies brought forward that starts to sort of strengthen our opportunity to ensure that these benefits are being delivered. So the Lawton report was Make Space for Nature in 2010. That's the sort of first report that introduced the terms bigger, better, more joined up, although it'd been around for a long time before that. People understood that. It sort of really brought that process to the fore. So that's talking about making areas that are existing quality for wildlife and nature conservation bigger, making them better quality, and then connecting those spaces, or connecting those spaces together to make them more joined up. Then in 2018, there's a 25-year environment plan was published. The government set out their framework, or they set out a desire to be the first generation to leave the environment in a better state than we found it, and to develop a nature recovery network. So that's the first mention we've got of the nature recovery network, which is those spaces being bigger, better, and more joined up. We had the Agriculture Act in 2020, which was saying that they'll be using public money for public goods. So rather than just supporting farming practices and subsidising those, farmers would be able to secure public money, but on the basis that it delivered something for the public. So that would be natural flood management. It could be improving biodiversity. It could be improving air quality. Reducing stormwater runoff. The Environment Act in 2021, it gained royal assent in 21, set species and habitats targets and a mandatory minimum 10% biodiversity net gain for developments. There was also the 30 by 30 pledge, which was to protect 30% of land and sea by 2030. So a lot of good intentions here, I have to say. See how well they'll deliver by 2030. So the Environment Act new duties brought in a few different things. So all planning permissions granted in England, except for things like householder applications. So if you want an extension on the back of your house, that would be exempt from biodiversity net gain, will have to deliver at least 10% net gain. There were also enhanced duties for local authorities to conserve and enhance biodiversity and report on their actions. Now, before we only had to have regard for biodiversity. Now we have to do more around conserving and enhancing and also reporting. So that's a statutory duty. So local authorities can't avoid this. They have to make that report on what they're doing and what's more they are going to do as well. And in complying with those duties, we have to have regard to the local nature recovery strategy. So biodiversity net gain and nature recovery. So what are they? So we've started to cover this a little bit. So net gain is an approach to development that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was beforehand. And nature recovery is about stepping beyond conservation into active restoration of the natural world and halting the decline in species abundance by 2030. So while we might have been managing sites and not having any decline in their value for biodiversity, that's not enough. We need to be making sure that these sites are improving in quality. So it's no good just saying we're halting the decline, because to halt the decline is no good. We need to turn that around and start improving these spaces. And better restoration of habitats leads to better delivery of ecosystem services as well, leads to better climate regulation, all those other things as well, and the added benefits. So local residents having access to quality spaces that are biodiversity, where they can have good nature connectedness, leads to significantly more health and well-being benefits for society, and therefore reduced impacts on things like the NHS as well, because we're reducing, by improving people's connectedness and health and well-being, you're reducing the likelihood of longer term chronic illnesses that need treatment. It's all linked together. So what is the Nature Recovery Network? So excuse me, having a sip of tea. So the Nature Recovery Network is a national network of wildlife rich places. So it'll expand and improve and connect across towns, cities, countryside and coast. So although in Birmingham we talk about our nature recovery network, we have to be mindful of the fact that that has to join up to anything that Solihull are doing, Sandwell, Walsall, Staffordshire, Worcestershire, Warwickshire, you know, where we abut those sort of counties and areas. So we need to make sure that we don't just think about what we're doing, but also how that connects to everybody else. So it's the intention will be to recover nature across England at scale and tackle crises of biodiversity loss and climate change and improve public health and well-being as well. So the intention is that we'll have this whole England-wide nature recovery network. Doesn't cover Wales, doesn't cover Scotland because they have devolved parliaments, although they are working on very, very similar things and they will be coming to the fore anyway. So what's the local authority's role in biodiversity net gain and nature recovery? So it'll be looking at planning decisions and local planning policies, setting strategy, linking to overarching council strategy and objectives. We have a duty to, I suppose, set out our part of the local nature recovery strategy, considering climate emergency, placemaking infrastructure, natural capital and ecosystem services. It'll be about embedding and joining up across council services, including estates, mapping evidence and data, working in partnership with other organisations, Natural England, Environment Agency, etc. Securing funding, delivering nature recovery on the ground, and engaging local communities. It says farmers and landowners, but we don't have many farmers in the city, but we do have land that we own, city owns, that does have tenant farmers on, so it does cover there. So we'll be looking at how all this is integrated into development. So it's expected that the delivery of Biodiversity Net Gain will primarily be or via on-site delivery. So when we're looking at development, developers will have to look at their site first, get an assessment of what the ecological value is of that. Can they replace that value and the 10% on site once they're done? So can they, if they're going to lose some grassland, can they retain some grassland areas and enhance it, make it better, improve the quality of it for biodiversity? They could be doing that. Then we go, this is what I'm saying about this sort of hierarchy, we're then going off-site as close as possible and in a strategically identified location. So that's what's set out in the local nature recovery network. Off-site as close as possible, but in an opportunity area. These phrases will come a bit clearer when we get to a map in a moment. Off-site elsewhere, but ideally within the local nature recovery strategy area. Or, then this is the last resort, purchase statutory biodiversity credit from the government. So the intention is that developers will have to deliver or fund the delivery of Biodiversity Net Gain. And that is directed by planning authority and the strategies that we set out. If there are no opportunities, then they can purchase statutory credits from the government. That's not clear yet, but anyway. Habitat creators mitigated, including any net gain, will need to have a management secured and funded for at least 30 years. So this is going to be interesting for them. They're going to have to fund all those costs. So in terms of how this is going to impact green space in Birmingham, if we're in delivering biodiversity net gain on our park sites, our open space, it will be generating funds to pay for those improvements and the long-term maintenance. Those of you who have been involved in Birmingham's Friends of Parks groups or had any involvement in local space will know that budgets have been cut over year after year after year. And so therefore the amount of management has been going down, or the quality of management is going down. This is going to hopefully start to halt and reverse some of that, because there'll be a different form of funding coming through. There'll also be regular monitoring for these habitats, both on and off site, and that's required. And the local authority is tasked with reporting on this to government as well. So we have to not only get the funding for that, we also have to monitor it. We also have to report to show that that benefit is there. So it's setting about a very strict framework for what we have to do. Okay, let's get onto a bit of a map. So this is a map of Birmingham, showing the Black Country area sort of just greyed out in the side there. So we've using existing data that we have of where our sites are and data on species and habitats that we already have. We've set out this map, which is sort of our current position of Birmingham and its ecological value. We've got these rated here from very high, medium, low ecological value. And you can see that our corridor sites, so again, they're showing out quite well here. This is the River Cole coming through here and up. We've got the River Ray coming in through here, up to there where it meets the city centre, then carries on through. The River Tame coming through here and across. But then we've got places like Senlis Park over here, Woodgate Valley, Hilltop, which is over in Handsworth. We've got, this is over at Castle Vale. You can see these areas we've got areas of high value, very high value, medium high value, but there's a lot of area which is low value or is not really recorded as such because it's in that urban area. So going back to thinking about the local nature recovery network strategy and that Lawton report principles, making areas bigger, better and more joined up, what we're setting out is a 25-year nature recovery vision, which is this map here. So this is now sort of showing areas where we need to be prioritizing action for biodiversity. So that could be habitat creation, habitat enhancement, habitat restoration. And we've based it around the same ecological corridors. So you can see here, but we're highlighting the areas on either side where nature recovery would benefit, or nature recovery interventions would benefit. So we're trying to increase and expand those areas, join those areas up. So again, we've got the dark green is our core expansion zones. Yeah, so we've got our high value core areas. Then we've got a core expansion zone 1, which is this sort of darker green color around the edge. So this is where we'd be prioritizing interventions through here, moving out into our other sites. So we've got these here. So these are other open space sites that would benefit from biodiversity improvements all through here. So you can see how many there are across the city. This will help expand that network. And then we've got the urban matrix recovery zone 2, which comprises all the features of the built environment within 100 meters of the core habitat zones. No, it's outside of that 100 meters, sorry. But those areas still provide opportunity for the protection, enhancement, and creation of green infrastructure. It's just that they would not necessarily have a higher value in terms of strategic significance for biodiversity as they would if they're in these dark green areas. This is all probably very complicated, I know, but it's I think it's useful to know the direction that we have to be taking as part of this Environment Act and council policy. So when we're talking about biodiversity net gain, I suppose in very simple terms, if you have a piece of land and you develop it and put houses on, but you don't retain any habitat, you've got net loss. If you have a piece of land and you develop it, and at the end of it, you still have a piece of land that is of value for wildlife, that could be a similar size or a better quality, then that's, I suppose, equating to no net loss. However, net gain then is you're doing that same process, but you're having to do more. You're having to put back what you've impacted and then some. So that'll be improved quality, improved structure, improved increased area, and that's where we get into a process of net gain. And this is, I suppose, calculated by something called habitat units, or through a process called habitat units. So habitat units are a measure of habitat. They could be areas such as grassland or woodland, or linear features such as hedges and streams, so watercourses. So in going through biodiversity net gain metrics, we have two separate things to consider. We look at area habitats and we look at linear habitats. And a development, if it impacts both, has to provide 10% on both. So there has to be a 10% increase in area habitats and a 10% increase or in linear features as well, or linear improvement. So these are measured by their area, but they're also defined by their quality as well. So we're defining the quality as being either poor quality, moderate quality, or good quality, plus their distinctiveness and ecological location status. So hard to replace or scarce habitats score higher value for a smaller area than, say, an easily to replicate common habitat. That means that the number of habitat units that are found on a site will vary based on those factors. Again, it makes it very complicated for people to get their head around, because it's not straightforward. You can't say that 100 square meters is one habitat unit. It depends what's there. So if we look at, I mean, again, you won't be able to see it particularly well on the slides, I would think, but when we forward this round, hopefully you'll see a bit more. So this is based on a hectare's worth of land. So 100 meters by 100 meters, that's 10,000 square meters. So lowland meadow has a very high distinctiveness. And when it's in good condition and an ecologically desirable location, its value is upward of 24 habitat units. On the other end of the scale, if we look at improved grassland, so that's sort of like your sports pitches or amenity parkland spaces, things that are not they're not particularly diverse in terms of flowering species. Don't have particularly good structure. They're all sort of the same. It's all, you know, well, it's not an area of mown grass really. It's all also the same type of quality and structure. So improved grassland has low distinctiveness. It tends to have poor condition because it's not floristically diverse. And if it's not in a strategic location, then the same hectare is only worth 2 habitat units. So in terms of creating biodiversity net gain, if you've got some improved grassland on the site, you could create net gain by changing your improved grassland towards a lowland meadow. It's not always straightforward. It's not always easy, but you could see how you could add value for wildlife, for biodiversity, by changing what you have from something that's of low distinctiveness and poor condition to something that's more of a high distinctiveness in good condition. Lowland mixed deciduous woodland, high distinctiveness, good condition, ecologically desirable location, can be anywhere around sort of 20 units per hectare. But conversely, when we're going down to some of these other places though, we can go developed land, sealed surfaces, buildings, no units, really. Has very low distinctiveness, no value for wildlife as such. That's how it's being classed as here. However, we do have things like vacant and derelict bare ground, and also open mosaic habitat on previously developed land. These do both have some value for wildlife, particularly open mosaic habitat, and that can be quite hard to recreate. And we do find these on previously developed sites, and they are something that has to be replaced. So just because it does have concrete and sealed surfaces, it doesn't mean that it has no value at all. It's just when you've got this very well managed areas. So for Birmingham, where we might be getting a lot of development in these sorts of areas, we might not be doing very well at all, because if we've got no units being impacted, there's no need for compensation. But that's a different matter. We'll come to that later. So how are these habitats recorded and habitat value established? And this is the bit I think that'd be useful for us to do as a field session at some point later in the year, is looking at this thing called UK HAB. So HAB just stands short for habitats. So it's the classification system that's being used to map out habitats for development sites, or sites that might be being put forward for delivery of off-site net gain. So the reason why this system was devised, there were lots of different systems of mapping habitats out, devised on plant communities, mostly. So we've got things like the National Vegetation Classification system. We've got things like phase 1 habitat assessments. But the UK HAB was seen to be needed because it needed to address inconsistencies between habitat and vegetation classifications, achieve consistency, so be able to collect data once and use many times, allow all these different organisations, so Natural England, Scottish Natural Heritage, National Resource Wales, Department of the Environment for Northern Ireland, and the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, to report consistently on habitats of European and national significance, and provide a uniform habitat context for social impact assessments and the application of mitigation hierarchy, planning for biodiversity net gain, and detailed green infrastructure plans. So it sets out a standardized baseline, because if you don't, it's like comparing apples and oranges otherwise. If you're trying to compare two different things, you can't ensure that you've got the same results coming out each time. So they've decided they're going to have a new standard, which is going to be the one that is used to measure all impacts on habitats and the mapping. In producing a map, I mean, I've taken this from actually a farming page, but this is showing what a map might look like of some of our park sites when we've undertaken the habitat assessment. So we'll have the boundaries set out, Here we've got individual, there are hedgerow boundaries between these, but we can see that these different color codings in here relate to these different parcels over here, and each one of these will be a different, maybe a different habitat type. So it's looking like these will be grassland sites here, but these will probably be arable sites within here. And we might have woodlands. We've got some woodland sites as well. So this dark green here is woodland sites. So each habitat area is mapped individually. So if we've got a very complex site with clumps of trees, areas of grassland, areas of rivers, streams, pools, each thing will be marked separately on a map, given a code and probably a color, and we can see a map like this. So that sets out the habitats, what the habitats are. The next thing then is coming on to habitat quality. And so within the biodiversity metrics, you can go and download this for free off the Natural England websites. If you search Biodiversity Net Gain, you can find all of the Biodiversity Net Gain metrics, all the spreadsheets, and all what we call these condition sheets. So this is the bit that we use to then look at each one of those habitat parcels and consider its habitat quality. So we've got everything going from coastal right the way through all grasslands, open land, sealed surfaces, woodland, trees, hedgerows, and rivers. And so there's a sheet for each, and there's also a set of criteria which we're going to look at now. So we've got this sheet here would be being used for woodland and forest, but for all of these different types of habitat. So it's looking at lowland beech and yew woodland, lowland mixed deciduous woodland, native pine woodlands, other coniferous woodlands, broadleaf woodland, mixed woodland. So within the UK HAB, it will tell you, you'll work out which one of these it is, because there's a set of criteria that you use to assess the habitat against, and it'll tell you what your habitat type is. So the first part, obviously, we would be doing on this is looking at site name, location, grid references, all that sort of detail that you need to tell you where your habitat is. The next part, again, this is a bit small, but is the condition assessment. And we've got A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hang on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Look, there's 13. 13 different criteria to assess the woodland at. And this is where, you know, the likes of yourselves who are starting to get more knowledge around looking at trees and woodlands would be able to start saying, well, actually, we could start to have a look at, we might be able to do a bit of an assessment on our local woodland and see what qualities is. This is where we can start to use this information to advise on what management work should be being done to improve it for biodiversity, for example. So the first questions are based, and the questions are all based on 3 sort of statements, and each one of these statements scores either 3 points, 2 points, or 1 point. Then those are totaled up. So if we just look through these, so the first one here is, if you're looking at a woodland, you've got age distribution of trees. So it says here 3 age classes present, 2 age classes present, 1 age class present. So this would be looking at trees that there is a description of what each of these classes means, but this will be looking at, do you have you know, trees that are really mature or maybe over mature? Do you have those that are in their sort of mid sort of part of their life, and do you have trees that are young, so new developing trees that are going to be the replacements over time? So you might find that in some woodlands that have been cleared out, that you might have 2 age classes, because maybe you haven't got any of those very older trees. Maybe the younger trees have been removed for some reason, or they've not been able to develop. 1 age class is going to be very much like a plantation woodland, coniferous plantation, where you've had all trees planted at the same age. So if you've got trees at all 3 age classes, you'd score it 3 points. If it's 2, 2 points. Then we've got things like wild, domestic, and feral herbivore damage. So this is looking at how much pressure there is from things like deer browsing, squirrel damage, all those sorts of things. Or could be perhaps it could also include some other kinds of damage from other browsing pressure. So again, no significant browsing damage to evidence of significant browsing pressure, and it's present in more than 40% of the whole woodland. So those of you who've did your level 2 that are on the call, remember we had a trip out to woodland in the Wye Forest, and we could see the difference between areas that have been fenced off from deer and those areas that have been left open to deer browsing. In those areas where there was deer browsing, there was often very little understory, very few younger trees coming through. We had the mature trees, but not much else. In the areas that were fenced off, we had lots of different layers of tree canopy cover going right away from the mature trees through down to newly establishing saplings. So we've moved down through the list. We've got invasive plant species, number of native tree species. So 5 or more native tree or shrub species found across the woodland parcel, down to 2 or less native tree or shrub species. So again, you know, a Sitka spruce conifer plantation is going to score 1 point because it's got 2 or less, whereas a nice piece of broadleafed deciduous woodland that has, you know, ash, oak, cherry, small leaf lime, hazel, holly, all those different things is going to be scoring 3 points. Cover of native tree and shrub species. Again, this has to be an estimation. Is it looking at greater than 80% of canopy trees and 80% of understory shrubs are native, down to less than 50%. Open space within the woodland regeneration. So look, all 3 classes present in the woodland. Trees 4 to 7 centimeters diameter at breast height. Saplings and seedlings or advanced coppice regrowth, down to no coppice regrowth. And so it goes on. Tree health, vegetation and ground flora. So looking at what the plant communities are. So for semi-natural ancient woodland, we'd be looking, have we got those indicator species there? Have we got bluebells, wood anemones, yellow archangel, dog mercury, all those kinds of species? That's the sort of thing that we'd be looking for. Have we got the right sort of ferns associated with the woodland type? So you can start to see how much knowledge people are going to have to build up in order to be able to undertake these assessments appropriately, because you have to know not also about the trees here, but also about the vegetation and the ground flora that make up that woodland community. And we've got vertical structure, veteran trees, and I think this is an interesting one as well. And this is one that I think could lead some people to have devalued some of the woodlands, because we have seen some people who are very overzealous in their removal of deadwood. So here we've got deadwood habitats. So 50% of all survey plots within the woodland parcel have deadwood, such as standing deadwood, large dead branches and stems, branch stubs and stumps, or an abundance of small cavities, down to things like less than 25% of the survey plots within the woodland parcel have deadwood. So if you've got a woodland manager who is fastidiously going around removing all the deadwood, removing all the stubs, having a very clean, tidy woodland, it's not going to score well for biodiversity. And then woodland disturbance again. So we've got no nutrient enrichment or damaged ground, and then this is based on the hectare. So once you top these up, you get a score. So if you've got more than 32 points, so 33 to 39 points, the condition score is classed as good. If you've got less than 26, it's poor. So from that, then we can also think about what would be the management objectives on there. So if we don't have a good age distribution, a management objective would be to improve that age distribution of tree species. So can you start adding younger trees? Can you ensure that you retain older trees longer if there's a reason they've been lost? If you've got invasive species, can you remove the invasive species? So this is how people can start to look at biodiversity net gain and say, okay, we can move this woodland. So if the woodland score was poor, we can see where it scored worst and start to act on those assessments. So we haven't got any veteran trees. Can we start a process of veteranization? for example. We haven't got appropriate ground vegetation and ground flora. We can do things like introducing native species. Can we do that? Can we change the amount of woodland disturbance? So could we, by creating a network of paths through the woodland, minimize the impact on some areas? Can we, by changing the way that the area around the woodland is managed, change the nutrient enrichment? I mean, this is particularly an issue on urban woodlands, where people are using their back fence and the woodland behind as a place to dump all their grass clippings and hedge cuttings and stuff. They think that they're not doing any harm, but actually it is enriching the nutrients of the soil. So that's a little bit about woodland side of things there. We do have individual trees as well. So there's an individual tree assessment. So this works on the same basis, but you've got less questions this time. So is the tree a native species, or at least 70% within the block of native species? The tree canopy is predominantly continuous, with gaps in canopy cover making up less than 10% of the total area. Tree is mature, more than 50% within the block are mature. Little no evidence of adverse impact on tree health by human activities. Natural ecological niches for vertebrates and invertebrates are present, but these have just got sort of yes, no questions on these, and then a pass criteria. So if you've passed 5 or 6, the trees seem to be in good ecological condition. If it gets fewer than 2 or fewer, it's seen as poor. I think there are some issues with this one, because in a rural setting, an individual tree is probably like to be native. It's probably okay that it's a native species, but in an urban environment where native species aren't always the most appropriate tree to be in an area, this is going to cause some issues if we're not passing on this condition assessment because the tree is non-native. So I think this is where we have to be very careful about how these things are used, because we know that within an urban environment like ours, where native species aren't ideal for use in the urban environment always, we do and will have to rely on non-native species. I think it's I don't know what to say, because I don't think it's ideal that that something might fail, a tree might fail at criteria or get marked down because it's not native, yet it still has a significant part to play in an ecological system. I think this is because this is something that's been devised by people who are looking at ecology in a very native setting, and urban environments aren't fully considered, I think, on this. Just one other thing to add to this. What's the time there? So we can go to some questions in a minute. So we mentioned earlier about sites that might have 0 baseline value. And what do we do there? Because, and this is something that we've argued for a long time about, that 10% net gain or looking at 10% or more net gain is fine if you are having an impact. If you're not having an impact, or the site scores a 0 habitat unit value to start off with, 10% of nothing is nothing. So you're not going to get any enhancement. But we know that to make our cities livable for the future, we are going to have to make sure that we increase the amount of greening within the urban environment. So within our planning policy review at the moment, we're looking at whether we can introduce something called a green space factor, or an urban greening factor, if you prefer, as it's more usually called in the UK. And this is a scheme that works by assigning a factor between 0 and 1 for various surface cover types. So with things like sealed surfaces being given 0 and the most natural cover being given a 1. So it works in a similar sort of way to habitat quality assessment, but we can set a threshold at which we want to see. So we might be saying that any new development might need to set a minimum target of, meet a minimum target of say 0.3 or 0.4 of an urban green factor. And it works like this, that you've got basically a development site such as this here, and the this is probably, this bit in the middle here is going to be a building, but or this bit here as a building, maybe say. Yeah, but this is a green roof in the middle of it. So we can see that an extensive green roof here, 21 square meters, has a 0.7 factor. We've got some sealed surfaces which don't score anything. We've got some amenity grass, which is this yellow showing around here. So that's scoring something there. And we've also got trees, and it does say in a minimum of 25 cubic meters soil volume. So we've got those around there. So we can top that score up, and then we can work out what the urban greening factor is on there. So we can top them together, divide by 100, and it gives us a 0.33 urban greening factor. So by doing this, we can give developers a clear steer as to how much greening we might want to see. It's not just about those sorts of features there. If we move to the next slide here. So this is one taken from one of the London-based documents. So we can see we've got surface cover types. So we've got things like semi-natural vegetation, woodland, flower-rich grassland created on site, scoring 1 point, wetlands, scoring 1 point. Moving down, and it's interesting to see as well that, where is it? I'm sure there was 2 different things of trees somewhere. Can't see it. Perhaps it isn't on this one. But there are 2 different pieces for green roofs. So we've got extensive green roof with substrate, minimum settled depth 80 mil. So we've got flower-rich green roofs scoring 0.7, but sedum roofs that everybody seems to rave about only scoring 0.3 because they're actually not great for biodiversity. So an extensive green roof of a sedum mat without substrate or other systems are scoring less. So the better the quality intervention that you put in, the more it scores. So this is a way that we can hopefully encourage developers to integrate more greenery into their developments. These sort of principles are being rolled out for developments around Digbeth. I don't know how many of you might have looked through things like the Smithfield Master Plan, but love it or loathe it, they're trying to use a similar sort of process, showing how green infrastructure can be incorporated across the entirety of the development, making sure that's spread out so it's accessible everywhere, rather than conglomerated in one sort